It's the morning show with Wayne. John McDonnell, who writes for us here on Flow News 24, he comments today about a previous article written by Ricky Lambert from our Flow News 24 desk here in Roseworthy, and pointing out the Labor victory in Western Australia and the incentive that must show for other states to copy the Mark McGowan model for slamming the borders shut. And John writes, the overwhelming support for Mr McGowan showed that people don't seem to realise how pernicious the Western Australian policy is. He adds that by way of example, an acquaintance recently decided that she and her husband would travel from Adelaide to Perth to meet up with their son, who had been working in the Northern Territory. They booked their tickets and paid for their accommodation for the short stay in Perth. As required by Western Australian law, 48 hours before they were due to fly, they applied for permits to enter WA. The application asked the applicants whether they had had contact with anyone from Victoria within the last fortnight. The acquaintance recalled that she had had a cup of coffee with her cousin at a cafe in Adelaide CBD. The cousin lives in regional Victoria, where there hasn't been a case of COVID for more than 12 months. The application carried a warning that there was a $50,000 fine for supplying misleading information, so the acquaintance decided to disclose the cup of coffee with her cousin. When the permits came back, the husband was unrestricted, but the lady who is the acquaintance, that was a 14-day quarantine. And since they'd only planned to be away for 5 days, she and her husband decided to postpone their trip for 4 weeks, which involved applying for refunds and rebooking and so forth. And while they were doing this, Mark McGowan announced that quarantine for travellers from Victoria would cease the following Monday. But this appeared to have no bearing on the requirement for South Australians to spend 14 days in quarantine if they had had contact with Victorians. You see the mess that it has created, and John puts this where he says the reason why McGowan is so popular is because he's practicing old-fashioned beggar-thy-neighbour protectionism. The economist and mathematician John Nash, who was portrayed by Russell Crowe in the film A Beautiful Mind, won a Nobel Peace Prize for showing that one economic community could make themselves better off through protectionism, but all its trading partners would be worse off. The beggar-thy-neighbour policy approach will tell against Western Australia, because if the other states do not have the same level of economic activity as it does, then the total quantum of goods and services and the taxation system that we have in place would then fall. Since this is all divided between the states, the amount of revenue going to Western Australia would decline. And there's a tendency for Queensland to want to go it alone also, because they are more dependent on tourism than Western Australia and so are more vulnerable to border closures. It would be a bad mistake, even if it is likely to make the government politically popular. At a federal level, they also need the money from Scott Morrison's government for airlines and tourism to pull them out of the mire. Paradoxically, the poll conducted in New South Wales over the weekend for Nine Media revealed that Gladys Berejiklian was as popular as Mark McGowan, even though her policies are diametrically opposite when it comes to border closure. The poll showed that if an election was held in New South Wales last weekend, the Labor Party would have been wiped out in that state. And this tends to confirm the view that it is not the policies but the management of the response to the pandemic that is important, writes John. And John makes some very real points. Protectionism or keep the borders open. I think we're favouring to get people moving again, have borders open. The COVID-19 response for closed borders has for some worked, but at the moment where there are virtually no COVID cases and only the quarantine issues that have to be considered, I think it is time for us to get back to normal.